I think that maybe Patsy had multiple personalities. I saw that in her one day, and I think that she may have gotten upset with JonBenet for some reason, and she may have hit her and not meant to hurt her.
John and Patsy didn't have anything to do with killing that little girl. And if they did, if it's proven that they did, I'll never trust anybody the rest of my life, because I never seen anything but a loving, kind, wonderful...
Linda Hoffman Pugh, the Ramsey family housekeeper who says she cleaned their toilets, made their beds, and heard the whispered conversations no one else did, now claims she has carried a secret for nearly 3 decades that changes everything we thought we knew about that night. According to Linda, what happened inside the walls of 755 15th Street was not a mysterious break-in or a random intruder. It was a pattern of escalating violence, practiced knots, missing objects, and a family scrambling to hide what they already knew. She insists her notebooks, the physical marks she saw on a 6-year-old child, the toys that were almost always damaged in the same strange ways, and the after-the-fact cleanup are not circumstantial. They are pieces of a human story that has been misread, misreported, and, she says, deliberately buried. If you want the full account of what she says took place, and why she believes those decades of silence are finally over for a reason that matters, subscribe to the channel now and drop your city and your thoughts in the comments below. Because Linda says the truth she's about to tell cannot wait any longer. Linda begins by locating herself in the house years before the tragedy, not as an outsider doing a single job, but as someone who lived inside the rhythm of the Ramsey home 5 days a week. She emphasizes how intimate that vantage point felt. The morning routines, the whispered phone calls, the rehearsed smiles after guests left. She tells us she saw the family perform for the world and then return to a private set of behaviors that the cameras never captured. Her voice in these scenes is steady, and she names dates and incidents in a way that underlines how specific her memory is, not a vague suspicion but a sequence of events she wrote down at the time because they frightened her. From the beginning, Linda frames her observations as a pattern. Small things, she says, that on their own might be dismissed. A broken doll, a cut on a child's face, a toy with its head twisted off, became, when repeated, a map of cruelty. She speaks about JonBenet and Burke as people she watched grow inside a household obsessed with image and performance. She remembers Patty focused on pageants and costumes in a way that felt like compulsion, practicing makeup and routines on a child who should have been allowed to be 6. She remembers John in his study, retreating into work, often absent when private incidents occurred. Most forcefully, she remembers Burke, 9 years old when Linda first worked in the home, as a boy with empty eyes, a child she describes as watching in a way that made her uneasy. She does not say the boy was born violent. She says the pattern of attention, neglect, and power in that home created a context where cruelty could escalate without intervention. The most chilling episode Linda recounts is dated and described in brutal detail. On December 2, 1996, she says she heard the scream no one should ever hear from a child in her care. She ran upstairs and found a locked bedroom door, a 6-year-old crouched and crying in a corner, pajamas torn, and a rope around her neck that was not tight enough to asphyxiate but tight enough to restrain. Standing over the child, according to Linda, was Burke with a piece of model train track he had been using to hit her. She says the explanation offered later, that the children were playing detective, was not true. She tells us the world in the little girl's eyes at that moment was terror, and the face of the older child reflected a disturbingly satisfied calm. She says she cleaned the child up, documented the injuries in a small notebook she kept, and tried to tell the parents only to be met with dismissal and minimization. In Linda's telling, that encounter was not an isolated roughhousing incident. It was an escalation in behavior she had been watching for months. Linda insists she kept records. She describes a little notebook in which she charted dates and injuries, odd bruises, toys broken in the same deliberate ways, and whispered comments she heard that she felt no one else would believe. The notebook, she says, might have been the most important piece of contemporaneous evidence had anyone taken it seriously at the time. She claims that after the death, items that could corroborate parts of her notebook vanished: Burke's baseball bat that she had seen swung around the house, a diary belonging to the child, and other personal items were removed or repainted over. She says walls that bore the marks of violent outbursts were patched and painted in ways that suggested purposeful erasure, and that the very habit of tidying the house became a way to eliminate traces that might point to internal trouble. As she moves through the week before Christmas in her recollection, the details accumulate. She speaks of the household tension making rooms feel cold, of children waking up different, of a child who used to run to her mother now walking on eggshells. She remembers the child saying chilling things in small, private moments, the kind of sentence no 6-year-old should have to say, "I'm practicing being invisible." She writes that down and keeps watching. She explains how the family's pressure to maintain an image, the costumes, the trophies, the expensive portraits and holiday cards, became a kind of performance that required sacrifices inside the home. The people watching the performance from the outside saw gifts and glitter. Linda says she saw bruises and hacked-off doll hair, and she decided to do something that many people later asked her about. She told a relative of the family, hoping for intervention. Linda's decision to speak to a relative is central to her account. She says she called a sister of one of the parents and begged for help, warning that things inside the house had gone beyond normal arguments. She recounts that the sister dismissed her concerns as holiday stress or childhood drama. That dismissal, Linda believes, was an early missed opportunity, a chance to redirect a family spiraling toward catastrophe. She knows her perspective is painful and imperfect, and she acknowledges the agonizing what-ifs. If she had called Child Protective Services, if she had insisted on a professional intervention, could this have ended differently? Those questions rage through her telling and fuel the moral weight of her later choice to break her silence. In narrating the day of the death itself, Linda's recollections are acute. She describes arriving early on Christmas morning because she had been asked to help prepare breakfast, noticing a bowl with pineapple remnants on the counter, and feeling an odd heaviness in a house that should have been brimming with holiday cheer. She says John came downstairs looking disheveled, Patty appeared shaken, and Burke came down with a strange, nervous energy that didn't resemble grief. At 10:47 a.m., she heard the scream that changed everything. She says she watched Patty run to the stairs, clutching a paper that would later be read to police as a ransom note, and she watched the choreography that followed. Quiet phone calls, whispered conversations, a father packing a small suitcase instead of immediately calling for help. She says the first 20 minutes were not pure panic. They were, in her words, a performance. She insists memories of those first 20 minutes matter precisely because they were so unlike the raw chaos one expects in the immediate discovery of a child taken or harmed. When the basement was searched and the child was found, Linda says she witnessed the body and the signs of a death that had occurred hours earlier. She describes the waxy pallor of rigor, dried blood in the hair, and bindings fashioned in a way she says matched what she had seen Burke practice with rope. She tells us the garrote and duct tape, the cord tied with a particular slip knot, and the paintbrush handle used to fashion a crude tightening mechanism all seemed not random but personal. The stick, she notes, appeared to come from Patty's art set. Linda does not present herself as a forensic technician, but she is precise about the mixture of materials, their origins, and the fact that some portions of the paintbrush remained missing afterward. She believes those physical items were meaningful because they linked back to the home and to tools only household members would have had access to. As Linda recounts the aftermath, the narrative turns from violent moments to a different kind of orchestration. She says that within hours the house ceased being a crime scene and became a war room. Lawyers arrived quickly, public relations specialists set the tone, and friends and family moved through spaces that should have been sealed. She insists that this rapid professionalization of response was not typical victim assistance, it was damage control. She says Mike Binham and Hal Hayden, names she provides, were advising the family in ways that, to Linda's mind, looked oriented toward protecting a reputation and a family member rather than seeking a transparent investigation. She describes being offered money to sign a non-disclosure statement, then threatened when she refused. She says her car was vandalized, she was surveilled, and she lived in fear. In Linda's account, the physical evidence that might have pointed to what she describes as the truth was mishandled from the start. She tells us the scene was not secured, that friends and family walked through rooms, that John carried the body and in doing so contaminated potential forensic traces. She argues that DNA later described in public as unknown male DNA could be a product of contamination and poor chain of custody practices rather than proof of an outsider. Linda insists these procedural failures mattered because they created doubt and allowed an alternative narrative, the intruder theory, to gain traction. Her claim is not that DNA was never found. It is that the meaning of the DNA was complicated by the ways the house was treated and by the hands that touched everything before specialists were allowed to secure the scene. To bolster her decision to speak now, Linda points to a private investigator she says contacted her, James Mitchell. She says Mitchell spent years tracing sealed records, interviewing former staff, and compiling a dossier she believes corroborates the pattern she documented. She tells us Mitchell uncovered school records showing troubling conduct by Burke, psychiatric notes she says were suppressed, and statements from other household employees who had similar recollections of mistreatment or suspicious incidents. She says that for the first time, multiple people's accounts begin to line up in ways that are not random. In her telling, the combination of contemporaneous notes, other staff corroboration, and Mitchell's forensic review make it ethically necessary for her to speak. One of the most consequential claims Linda relays involves a forensic re-examination, she says, of the garrote and other items using modern techniques. She relates Mitchell's contention that new microscopic analysis of the rope and fibers connected the garrote materials to items that once belonged to members of the household. She tells us Mitchell has suggested that knot patterns match techniques a young boy might have learned in scouting, that cellulose fragments on the garrote match a paintbrush from the house, and that fibers were consistent with clothing Linda remembers being removed or disappearing after the death. These are explicit forensic claims and, crucially, Linda emphasizes they are the kind of things that could be tested openly today with upgraded DNA and material science tools, but only if evidence remains preserved and authorities permit retesting. At this point, Linda also acknowledges the legal and practical limits. She is clear that even if corroborative evidence were produced now, prosecuting someone who was 9 at the time would be complicated under Colorado law. Her motivation for speaking, she insists, is not necessarily to see a criminal trial but to force a public accounting, to prompt fresh forensic testing, and to lift the secrecy that has protected parts of the record for decades. She frames her speech as a demand for transparency and for tests that modern labs can now run on materials previously examined with older technology. Her focus is on truth and on giving this child, remembered forever at 6 years old, an honest accounting of what happened. Linda's narrative is not without controversy, and her script anticipates that. She repeatedly acknowledges that memories can be imperfect, that her account is retrospective, and that some in the public will see contradictions. She says she is prepared for skepticism, but she pushes back hard against an easy dismissal. The specificity of her details, the contemporaneous notes she kept, and the corroborative statements Mitchell reportedly collected, she argues, move her testimony from anecdote into evidentiary relevance. She refuses to reduce her story to gossip. Instead, she offers particular incidents, dates, and physical descriptions that could be investigated independently. Perhaps the most painful portion of Linda's telling is personal. She describes the moral cost of silence. She says she lived with fear, late-night calls from unknown numbers, the threat of physical danger, and the sense that continuing to speak would invite retaliation. She names the emotional toll, estrangement from her own family, sleeplessness, and the weight of knowing she had seen a child afraid to disclose the reality of her home. She frames her eventual decision to speak as an act of conscience, not revenge, motivated by the hope that transparency might lead to corrective action, even long after criminal prosecution becomes unlikely. Linda's account also seeks to explain how the public narrative became so dominant in the other direction. She names supermarket headlines and eager reporters who reinforced the intruder theory. She names professional PR and legal teams who managed a version of events favorable to the family, and she names investigatory mistakes that seeded confusion. Taken together, she argues, these elements enshrine the intruder narrative in public memory and made it extraordinarily difficult for anyone with a different memoir of the household to be heard. Her claim is simple and bitter. The system was not designed to hear a housekeeper's voice over the roar of money, reputation, and professional influence. As she approaches the conclusion of her account, Linda outlines the tangible steps she believes could and should be taken. She asks that any remaining physical evidence be retested with modern methods, that sealed psychiatric and school records be open to independent experts, and that an impartial audit be conducted of the chain of custody for items like the garrote, the baseball bat she says vanished, and the diary that allegedly disappeared. She asks that witnesses who were intimidated or paid speak without fear by offering protections and, where appropriate, legal counsel. She urges public pressure to produce transparency, arguing that absent public attention, political and institutional inertia will likely preserve the status quo. Linda's final appeal is personal and simple. She asks viewers to imagine a child who was not allowed to be a child, who was told her worth depended on beauty, and who learned early to make herself small to avoid attention. She asks us to imagine the moral responsibility of adults around that child and whether silence or image management should ever trump the safety of a living being. She says she cannot force institutions to act, but she can force a conversation and a public record that acknowledges what she says she saw. In closing, Linda returns to the small details that made her decision to speak unavoidable: the rope around a small neck, the dried blood in a child's hair, the tiny notebook she kept, and the offers she refused to sell her silence. She asks for one thing above all else: that people who watch this listen with a deliberative mind, demand transparency, and push for the scientific retesting she says could confirm parts of her account. She recognizes that not every viewer will accept her testimony, that some will dismiss it as sour motives or faulty memory, and that others will be shocked into anger. She asks only that people insist on the facts, that if material evidence exists, it be examined with the best modern tools and with open, independent oversight. Her final words in this telling are both an accusation and a plea. She accuses a culture in which reputation and wealth can muddy the search for truth. She pleads for the voice of a 6-year-old to be heard honestly at last. She does not ask for instant retribution. She asks for truth, for records, and for the courage of institutions to retest and re-examine evidence in light of new science and new witness testimony. If Linda's account is true, she says, then a little girl's life was betrayed long before the cameras arrived. If it is not, then a wrong has very publicly been levied against people who cannot be tried again. Either way, she argues, the case deserves modern forensic scrutiny and a public, independent review. She wants those in power to stop guarding reputations and start answering questions. For her, for the child she loved, and for anyone who believes that truth matters above all else, she says this moment is that chance. This is Linda Hoffman Pugh's assertion of what she believes really happened inside a house that the world watched for weeks and then turned into decades of speculation. She has put dates, descriptions, and named witnesses on the record. She has asked for modern tests, and she has volunteered to repeat her testimony under oath if authorities call. Whether you accept her account or not, she has one final request: treat the case like the living reality it involved, not a headline or a cold file. Demand transparency, demand forensic clarity, and demand that the voice of a tiny, silenced child be treated with the seriousness it deserves.